been another edition of React Hacks. This is part 2 for Stripe credit card payments. In the first video, I showed you how to configure the React front end and the Ruby back end so that we could use Stripe. And now that we've finished that configuration, I want to show you how I built this checkout component and how Stripe is going to process credit card payments for me. First is this form here, which is a custom component built by Stripe. And that's nice because I don't have to worry about creating a form or handling a customer's sensitive information. The engineers at Stripe have already built this component for me, and so they've taken care of the security concerns when you're handling someone's credit card information. And what's going to happen is I'm going to type in a credit card number, and certainly not my own, and this is just a fake credit card number. If you want to test, this Stripe component on your own application, you can go to their website and they have a whole list of credit cards that are available to use. They're completely fake, they don't do anything, but Stripe knows to accept them as real credit cards, even though they're not. And this is what's going to happen. So when I hit this checkout button, the first thing is I'm going to send this credit card information to Stripe, and Stripe is going to create a payment method. And from that payment method, Stripe will send back to me a token. Then I'm going to take that token, make an API request to a backend that I've built myself, which will include that token. In the backend, I will create the order and send back to Stripe the details of that order along with the token that it gave me. Stripe will process the payment, and if it's successful, they'll send back to me an ID which will hold the information of the order and the payment that has been processed. And finally, once you're done with that, you'll see process payment here on the screen while we wait. I will use router to push you to the order page, and you can see that I've added the charge here. This is the ID that Stripe sends back to you once it is finished processing the payment, and now we're on the order page. So let's take a look at the code. And I was going to say quick, but probably not. This actually involves a fair amount of work. And the cool thing is Stripe builds most of the stuff that I'm going to use for me. The trick is knowing where, when, and how to use it. First, I want to cover the checkout component, and really all it is these three things here. It's this elements, which is something that Stripe gives to me, and it has an attribute called Stripe, and I'm going to pass to it this object called Stripe lib, which we'll cover in a little bit. And then this checkout form, which is a custom component that I built, and that form does most of the work, and I'm passing to it the user so we can use its ID when I make the API request. And then looking inside of that checkout form, I'm first going to, actually before I create the checkout form, I need to cover that object that I gave to the elements component, which is where I'm going to use the API key that I covered when I configured Stripe in the last video using this load Stripe hook that Stripe has given me. And that's the object I'm going to pass to that elements component that we saw down here. Now inside the checkout form, I'm going to use this use history hook to eventually forward the user to the order page. Global state, the URL, and the token, these are things that I have stored specifically in this React application, and that's how I'm going to make my post request to my backend API. Close cart comes from this custom hook that I built, and that's going to close the cart once we're finished processing the payment. And then I've created two sets of state, one for error and one for loading, and those are going to print different messages to the screen depending on states. As we saw, processing payments had popped up once I clicked the checkout button because we were then loading. Now we need to use these two hooks that Stripe gives us, use Stripe and use elements, and those will come in handy when we create a payment method. And so this is a form. Essentially what we have to do is submit the form and create this large function to handle that submit. So I've created this handle checkout. And with any form, I'm going to want to run e.prevent_default to stop the page from reloading. And then I'm going to set the state of loading to true so that processing payments appears on the screen. So now we've got to the first step of the Stripe credit card payment, which is to create a payment method. And this is where I'm going to use those two hooks from Stripe, use Stripe and use hook. And this is an async function, so I'm going to use await, use that Stripe hook, and then create a payment method. The type is going to be credit card. They do accept several other forms of payment, but I've designed this application to accept credit card, so the type is card. And then we're going to give it that credit card information using this elements hook that we used from Stripe, get element, and then pass it the card element. And card element is that custom component that Stripe built for me. And it's what you enter your credit card information into. That's the custom component they built, so I don't have to worry about handling anybody's credit card information. Frankly, I don't want to. I wouldn't know what to do with it. So now we're going to create a payment method, and that's going to use the Stripe hook, and that's, oh sorry, we already covered that. So that's going to either return an error or a payment method. Now if it returns an error, we're going to set state to error, and that will print whatever the error message is onto the screen, and then we're going to return, so the function will end. But if it returns a payment method, this is when I'm going to make a post request to my own API, and I'm going to make sure to pass the token from the user because this is a route that is covered by my authentication middleware. And then in the body, I'm going to send the ID of the user as well as that token that Stripe has sent back to me. And then if we look at the back end, what's happening is if we go to the create route, I've covered this in an earlier video, so real quickly what I'm doing is finding the user using that JOT token, and then I'm going to create a new order and create a total that will be updated as we create order items. From the user's cart, I'm going to create an order item out of every cart item in there, and then update the total and delete the cart items. So now I have most of my order complete, but I want to add a charge, and that's where today's lesson comes into play. And I'm going to use this module called payment intent that comes from Stripe, and I'm going to then create a new payment intent and pass it the total from the order, and then give back to Stripe that token that it sent me, and now it's going to actually process the payment, and if that is successful, it will return to me the charge, and I'm going to update the order with the ID from that charge. And that's how a user could, or not a user really, but that's how someone could access information about that specific payment. So once we have successfully processed a payment, I'm going to push the order to, or push the user to the order page with that specific order. I'm going to clear the credit card form and then use my close cart hook to close the cart, and it will finally reset states. So that takes you through today's lesson. My application can now handle credit card payments, which I think is pretty cool. I hope you enjoyed it. I'll see you tomorrow.